really don't know what to take away from this, other than it's yet another theological snowflake that disables comments and ratings because they're afraid that anyone from outside their echo chamber is going to point out just how wrong they are. But this time, I'm looking at an apologist who in turn is trying to debunk another video, which is kind of an interesting concept. I'm debunking a debunking. Okay, whatever, let's take a look. Yeah, that's, laughable?
There's a YouTube channel called ScienceNet that does various videos promoting atheism, and earlier this year they did a video titled 7 Times Atheists Went Next Level Beast Mode, and it had some common arguments from atheists, so I figured we'd do a response video on it. Let's take a look at the first clip.
Now, I've seen that video and several others from that channel, and sometimes they do a good job and sometimes, frankly, they don't. Now, keep in mind, I go into these videos blind most of the time, so I've got no idea what ideas he thinks he's going to be debunking. I might even agree with him. I don't know. So let's take a look.
Since neither can know, you've got to be agnostic. Well, okay, that's fair enough. But do you, follow the same rules with fairies and Santa? No, you don't.
Okay, and this is something that I see atheists try to use pretty often, and I'm always surprised, considering the obvious flaw in trying to compare fairies and Santa to the existence of the all-powerful creator of the universe.
Except there really isn't that much of a difference. All of them are claimed without any objectively verifiable evidence. You just like the idea of your god more than you like the idea of fairies or Santa, but that really doesn't make them all that different.
But aside from that, let's break down the actual argument they're trying to make here. What they're trying to say is that the existence of God is irrelevant, or only as relevant as the existence of goblins or fairies.
No, at least I don't know that that's the point that's being made here. The point that I take away from it is that the existence of God is no better supported than the existence of goblins or fairies or Santa Claus. And if you're going to be rational and apply a consistent rational view to the world, if you're going to reject goblins and fairies on the basis of there being no evidence, then you have to also reject the existence of gods for the same reason.
But the flaw here is that there are 2 requirements when deciding if the existence of something supernatural is relevant. The first question of relevance is, does this supernatural being have authority over me? Is it some kind of higher power?
No, that has nothing whatsoever to do with anything. The only question worth considering is, does this supernatural entity exist? If it's not real, then by definition, it can't have any authority over anyone. So we only have to ask whether or not there's any reason to think this thing is real, and how would we go about determining whether anything in reality actually exists. It's only after we establish reality that we can even consider things like authority.
And this, of course, filters out fairies and goblins, whereas God, on the other hand, created the world and all that is in it, therefore has ultimate authority over all of creation.
That's just a bunch of faith-based gobbledygook. It's a bunch of empty claims made without any support. And of course, you notice how he filtered out Santa Claus, instead substituting goblins. And I think that was on purpose, so nobody could point out that supposedly Santa has authority over whether or not you get any Christmas presents. But then again, he's turned off comments so nobody can ever correct him, but we kinda expected that, didn't we?
Now, there are atheists who try to say that this isn't true, but of course they neglect their own argument in their daily lives. For example, if you were to build a chair from scratch, you could decide what you wanted to do with that chair. You could decide whether you wanted to sit on it, stand on it, burn it, you could call it whatever you wanted. Now, of course, there's limitation because you are human, which is where God's omnipotence comes into play.
Yet another empty claim. But let me step back here and say that yes, if you create a chair, you can do pretty much whatever you want to with it because you demonstrably created it. But you can't, for instance, light it on fire and throw it through your neighbor's window. But yeah, otherwise, you've pretty much got free reign. Now, let's ask ourselves if that's true of anything you create, like, say, intelligent life. And I would argue no, and so would most people. That's not limited to creating life in a lab. If you just went and had a child, can you do anything you want with that child without limits? Of course not. So the idea that this God thing can just do whatever the hell he wants, it's on pretty sketchy moral ground to begin with.
The second question of relevance is, has this supernatural being utilized its authority? Has it communicated and preserved some sort of law to its creation?
What difference does it make? Because you still haven't proven that this God thing actually exists in the real world. All you can do is provide human-written books that claim that God is real and has passed along commandments to humanity. That doesn't make it so.
And this is where the Bible becomes a standalone document, not only because of its claim to be the direct word of God, but also because of its historical harmony with secular documents and its unity within itself, both of these proving its preservation.
All of which is meaningless. It claims things. You can't prove that those claims are true. People in the past have taken those claims seriously and integrated them into secular documents. So what? And unity within itself? Give me a break. That's laughably absurd.
I think that using the word God or the attitude of faith toward that which you don't know is a cop-out. It's a way of slapping a label onto something rather than trying to understand it.
Oh, kind of like the faith that you have in science to be able to give a naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe, life, and information?
Yeah, no faith required, my friend. All of those things are demonstrably so. That's how science works. It provides a framework within which we can testably and objectively verify ideas about the universe. Science provides testable predictions. There's no faith required because we can independently use scientific principles to consistently test theories and come up with demonstrable results. Unlike religion, of course.
Even though the more we study these things, the more we see that they are far too complex to be explained naturally.
Only to the incompetent and ignorant. Science has no problem whatsoever explaining things naturally. In fact, science has never seen a single instance where anything they see is inherently beyond the naturalistic explanation. You might not like it, but that's because you've got your head in the wrong book.
And you cannot try to claim that these explanations already exist. Every single naturalistic theory for these origins breaks basic scientific law, like the law of biogenesis and the law of causality.
There is no law of biogenesis. That's something Pasteur came up with long ago, and it's been long since debunked. And the law of causality is something Ayn Rand came up with, and that's never been taken seriously in scientific circles. But this is what happens when you pay attention to creationist websites, which is where all of these absurd claims come from.
You cannot get life from non-life, and you cannot get something from nothing.
Yeah, says the guy who believes God created everything from nothing.
People have a real fear of death, and they always have done, they always will do. And there are always people who can provide explanations for what happens. If you tell people they're looked after, it makes them feel better than if you tell them they're alone. So people who believe in reason on these things are always at a disadvantage because we don't have soft fairy tales.
Okay, here he is confusing the fear of death for the instinctual desire that you and I have for a world beyond this one.
No. We have an instinctual desire to continue to live as programmed by natural selection so that you can pass along your genes to the next generation. The fear of death is something that evolution has given us, and frankly, I think it's outlasted its usefulness. But there's nothing proving that we have an instinctual desire for an afterlife. It's just nonsensical.
Which is why at 99% of funerals, they talk about how the person is hopefully in a better place.
That's for the good of the people left behind, to make them feel better about losing a loved one. But that's all funerals are for. The one who's dead, they don't care.
And this actually shows as evidence for the existence of God, because you and I intrinsically long for a place that is all good and lacking the evil that we see in this world.
Speak for yourself. I have no interest in your magical, mystical fantasy land. I know it's completely unrealistic, and I care about reality. You're just pretending that your fantasies have any place in reality, and you're just wrong.
So yes, belief in an afterlife does cater to this need, but he's also overlooking the fact that naturalism caters to the desire to please oneself without limitation.
No. Naturalism doesn't cater to anything. Naturalism, at least as far as every shred of evidence that we have, simply exists. It's the default position supported by all of the evidence that we can muster. It doesn't make any value judgments whatsoever.
In other words, if there's no God, then there's really no ultimate law, and you can kind of just do whatever you want, which is really what people want to hear.
You haven't proven that even if there is a God, there is any ultimate law. You haven't proven anything at all. You just assume that you're right. But reality, that thing that we all live in whether we like it or not, says otherwise. We're all accountable to each other. We're accountable to society. That's demonstrably how things work. You're taking your fantasies and pretending that they make any sense at all. But they don't.
You are convinced that every person believes that there's a God. And you are convinced of this because you are convinced that God has revealed this in the Bible. And my question was, how do you know that God has revealed anything?
Okay, so what the questioner does here is he mashes the two most crucial questions in Christian apologetics and combines it into one question.
And that's a damn good question to ask. One that I'm pretty sure you will have no answer for and will just make an excuse over. Let's watch.
So the first question he implies here is, can you prove God exists? And that is followed directly by the question, can you prove that God has actually communicated with us? And although these are extremely complicated questions, I will attempt to answer them briefly.
No, you won't. Let's be honest, you just won't. Because we all know you can't. It isn't possible for you to answer these questions because you have no means to even make an attempt. But sure, go ahead.
Now, although I cannot prove that the answer is yes to both these questions, I can show that beyond reasonable doubt, God does indeed exist and he has communicated with us.
No, you can't. You're going to fail just like every single Christian apologist who's ever come before you has failed.
Now, there are many arguments for the existence of God, but one of my favorites has to do with the source of information. For example, when you are reading a book, you know beyond reasonable doubt that somebody wrote the information down on that book. The ink didn't write the information itself. Somebody used the ink to put the information on the page. And no matter how long you spend studying the physical attributes of that ink, you will never be able to find a non-intelligent explanation for how the information got there.
It's the argument from ignorance. Whee!
And in the same way, you and I each have a 3 billion letter long book inside of us called DNA, which acts as a massive control panel for our entire body.
No. It's not a book. It's a jumble of chemicals that code for how we will turn out. Nobody wrote it. It was constructed via natural selection using entirely naturalistic methods. But you don't like that idea, you don't comprehend it, thus you engage in an endless parade of ignorance from personal incredulity.
And each letter is placed perfectly in order to allow this to happen.
Tell that to the many people who are born with birth defects. Please, tell them how perfectly every single chemical is placed. Go ahead.
DNA has a magnificent ability to command each and every protein inside of us to fold correctly in order to prevent disease and maintain basic bodily function. So my question to every atheist is, why do you so quickly accept intelligence when it comes to words on a page, but when it comes to writing the most complicated system known to mankind, you refuse to let a divine foot in the door?
So, what created God? After all, if you're going to posit that God is so much more complex than we mere mortals are, then the information that is God could not possibly have come about without an even more complex creator. So, who is your God's God? Go ahead and give us an answer for that.
And this leads me to the second question which was asked here, which was basically, has God communicated with us? And this is essentially a question of the validity of the Bible, considering its claim to be the very word of God.
Why do you arbitrarily limit this to the Bible? There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of supposed gods out there. Why do you insist that it has to be yours? Why couldn't whatever god is out there have written the Quran, or the Vedas, or the Enuma Elish, or some other religious text? Why couldn't the one true God, Xenu, have inspired L. Ron Hubbard to write Dianetics? You seem just a little biased here.
Now, there are many angles I can take when trying to prove the validity of the Bible, and I do not have nearly enough time to go into all of them.
That's okay. They're all going to fail because none of them have any evidence whatsoever behind them.
But I will leave links to multiple articles that address the subject in detail. I would, however, like to address one thing on the topic, and that is the most detailed prophecy of Jesus Christ in the entire Old Testament, and that can be found in Isaiah chapter 53. In this chapter, Isaiah inscribes an airtight description of a man who pays the ultimate penalty for the sins of the world. This is exactly what Jesus experienced 800 years after the book of Isaiah was written. And it just so happens that the Great Isaiah Scroll was the most preserved of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It contained all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah from the copies that we previously had, which, by the way, were 1,000 years newer than the Dead Sea Scroll copies.
You're talking about the suffering servant prophecy or the fourth servant song, which I've already addressed in other videos. And it's just wrong. It refers to the suffering of Israel. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus. Of course, one thing that we have to point out is that we cannot prove that anything in the New Testament concerning Jesus actually took place. So claiming that the Old Testament proves the New Testament is absurd because you can't prove that any of the Jesus stories were real in the first place.
And none of this is even mentioning the some 2,000 biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled throughout history. Sorry, atheists, I just don't have enough faith to believe that all that happened by coincidence.
There's no coincidence necessary, it's all wishful thinking. All you're doing is you're taking your pre-existing beliefs and you're shoving them as hard as you can into the Old Testament and seeing what you want to see. It's not that hard to figure out, guys.
I mean, their best argument, ironically, is that it's just faith.
Pretty pathetic, really, isn't it?
Well, it is pathetic, but they mustn't ever engage in logic.
Okay, this might be the most annoying and unfair of all the atheist arguments. They are blatantly ignoring the fact that the founders of modern science, the vast majority of them, have been theists, and a lot of them have been Christians. Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Galileo, Francis Bacon, the guy who literally came up with the scientific method. And this has not ceased in modern times. You have people like Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, Frank Turek. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of highly intellectual beings who believe in God and believe in Jesus Christ.
I always love this line of reasoning. First off, all of those old scientists lived at a time where not only did the knowledge necessary to reject religious belief not exist yet, but the church had such absurd control over everyone's lives that anyone who denied faith in God could have been imprisoned, as Galileo was, or murdered outright, as Giordano Bruno was. The idea that all of these scientists were Christians for rational reasons is ridiculous. And modern scientists, the overwhelming majority are not. 93% of the scientists in the National Academy of Sciences are open atheists. You're cherry-picking a very tiny percentage of scientists who pay any attention whatsoever to your absurd beliefs.
So no, atheists, you cannot claim to be the only ones who look at things objectively, the only rational ones.
First off, we don't. But we can claim that Christians and other theists do not, because demonstrably, they do not. Being rational means following a certain specific methodology, which the religious simply do not follow. It has nothing to do with being atheists. It has to do with following the laws of logic and reason. That's how most people got to be atheists in the first place, because we recognized that religion fails miserably in that regard.
Even Pew Research did a study a couple years back and found that 51% of scientists believe in some sort of higher power.
Yeah, only if you include philosophers in the survey. Philosophers are not scientists. Philosophers and sociologists and historians and other so-called soft scientists, they're not really scientists. They don't do any actual research. And even if 51% of these so-called scientists believe in some kind of vague higher power, that's still far, far, far lower than the national average.
An important point here is that the less evidence there is for something, the more faith you have to believe it. And the reality is you have to have a lot more faith to be an atheist than you do to be a Christian.
Which is probably the stupidest thing theists ever say. Clearly, they have no idea what atheism even is.
If what you believe is demonstrably false, and you want to pass it off as true in a science classroom, I have an issue with that.
Oh, I completely agree. Why don't you start with clearing the science classroom of the idea that natural selection can cause change between one animal type to another animal type and also gain genetic information in the process. These are things we can't even do using artificial selection. Maybe save that idea for like a secular religions classroom or something.
Except you're totally wrong. And it isn't like this is something brand new that our intrepid apologist simply doesn't know about. People have been changing allelic frequency for centuries through directed breeding. Today we're crossbreeding completely different species to produce entirely new ones. We're even taking animal genes and putting them into plants. Anyone with half a clue knows this is happening. But you know,
religion isn't harmless. It's when your God starts telling you that you should kill homosexuals, and
Exactly.
that's when it's not harmless anymore.
Yes, and what you're describing is called jihad, and it's Islamic extremism.
Except it's not limited to Islam. We see exactly the same thing happening in Christianity in Africa. Uganda barely avoided having a death to homosexuals law, pushed very strongly by American terrorist and criminal against humanity Scott Lively and his ilk. And let's not forget that groups like the Westboro Baptist Church exist, who infamously demand death to gays. Or do you just have blinders on where Christianity is concerned?
So these have been some of the most common arguments from atheists. And honestly, we haven't heard a single positive reason to believe in atheism.
You can't believe in atheism. There's nothing to believe in. This just proves you have no clue what you're talking about. Atheism is the rejection of religious claims on the basis that there's no evidence whatsoever to support them. That's all atheism is. Rent a clue.
All we've heard is attacks against theism, and as it's been clearly shown, these attacks just don't hold water.
Except they do. You're just such a fanatic that you're incapable of stepping back and evaluating your beliefs in light of the actual, demonstrable, objective evidence. You just don't care. Whether what you believe is factually true or not is entirely irrelevant to you. It makes you feel good, so it's gotta be true. And that's really sad. I mean, the more I look at things like this, the less sympathetic I am towards these mindless apologists, if I was ever sympathetic before. There are reasons why nobody takes these people seriously, and while they feel the need to turn off all communication with the outside world, because they know that their views are seriously unpopular. They know that in a free marketplace of ideas, their beliefs fail miserably. They can't stand up to a rational evaluation, so they hide in their religious safe spaces where nobody can tell them that they're wrong. But they are. It's obvious that they are. Obvious to anyone but their little deluded selves. What the hell is wrong with these losers?
Everything changes.